And welcome back. I've been talking to Viv Keenan here, weaver and artist extraordinaire, about her life as an artist, and we were just talking about how there seems to, one could call it perhaps a revival, resurgence, or fresh growth of the artist across the board here in New Zealand. Viv, you were saying that there's been really sort of a coming out of the 90s where people were much more focused on consumers and produced materials. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, when I look back, the 1970s and the 1980s were a really good time for crafts, art people in New Zealand. There was a lot going on. There was a lot of opportunity to make a living because people were interested in buying New Zealand-made objects. And then in the late 80s, the government opened up all the import licenses, and we just couldn't compete with the cheap goods that were coming in. And at the same time as that happened, I think we went into another recession, so people were, a bit reluctant to spend money on the much more expensive New Zealand-made items when they could buy, 5 for the same price of something that was imported. So things really, really went backwards for artists, craftspeople, and it really didn't, I think, since the late 1990s. There has been a revival, and there always was an appreciation of what New Zealand people were doing, but perhaps people didn't have the money as well, and so that made a very big difference to how their spending went. But since then, there's been a lot happening in New Zealand with artists, sculptures, craftspeople being able to make a living again. I mean, I'm able to make a living, and it has taken a while to come back to that, but we're certainly there. And every town that you go to in New Zealand, everyone has a really good gallery with work of locals. And I've never seen that anywhere else in the world, really. Maybe Ireland was a little bit similar. But New Zealand is fantastic in that respect. So there's a lot of opportunity for people in New Zealand. And people really do appreciate it. And we get a lot of tourists who buy our work and it's taken back overseas. So that's a really good aspect of how things can work when you have the opportunity to put your work out there.
And would you say in your involvement in the arts and crafts scene that people's sense of appreciation of art, appreciating the value and the justified money expense, if you like, of art, has that evolved as well?
Well, I think it has. I think people are probably more aware of the time that artists or craftspeople put into their work. You often, well, not often, but you get people who come along and say, "Oh, how long did that take?" And that in their minds they're trying to work out how much you're charging an hour. But it's not. You can't think of it like that because there's so much experience that goes into pieces that I'm producing now, say, or anyone else has been practicing for some time. And it's that experience as well that, that's what you're paying for, and there's no way you can put, an hourly rate on a piece of art that someone's made. But, on the whole, I think people appreciate the uniqueness of what is produced in New Zealand, because it is really unique, and it's been really good seeing the development of New Zealand artists, well, probably of New Zealand as well, into this Pacific nation rather than that colonial thing that we've had for so long, which was valid, but we've outgrown that, and we're growing into the Pacific, which is great, and it's really had an impact, I think, on New Zealand artists.
I find it interesting to sort of say that there's a whole sense, there's a whole years of experience that go into a piece of art. And in one sense, when one pays, a lawyer or a doctor for their services, the hourly fee one ends up paying is not just labour. One does actually pay for the years of study and experience that a person has accumulated.
Yeah.
Do you think an artist, in that sort of sense, also goes through a educational period where it could say, look, I'm going to be an artist. I'm going to spend the next 3 or 5 years learning to be an artist at the University of Life.
Yep.
And during that time, I'm going to pay my student fees to what I need to do.
Yep.
And does it sort of go through that? Because with that comes a sense of also professionalisation.
Yeah, well, I think you're right, and it's really interesting that you put it like that, because I think that's what a lot of us do. We don't go to art school for whatever reason, and but we spend a lot of time developing our skills, and it really amounts to the same thing. And so I think that has to be a part of, what that is a part of the end product. Those years of experimenting, maybe not earning much money, but just focusing on what you're doing so that you can develop, and that you're and I guess we do workshops and things, so we do sometimes pay to do courses, maybe not for a year, but little courses, workshops that you do, and they're all helpful and they all have some influence. So I think it is you're self-educating yourself, really.
So I hope if there's any budding artists listening out there that they take inspiration out of this and say, look, don't give up. The time that's going in there without anybody appreciating your art, it's you're paying your student time there. It's your student fees you're paying. Hang on in there because it will come back to you.
Well, it does, and I think if you can do that, and if you can, focus on what you're doing and developing whatever it is you're doing, and commit yourself to that, it will, as long as you are able to, support yourself in some way, it is worth persevering with, because we all go through it. We all go through the first couple of years or so, wondering what the hell we're doing, and trying to pay all the bills, but it does pay off. But it needs commitment and it needs focus, and you really need to focus. That's the biggest thing, I think.
And it must help, I imagine, and I want to talk to you after we take a little break here about that, to be part of a community like ours here, which I think is quite, we have a good sprinkling of artists here that must sort of be there to support and inspire each other. Yeah. So I'm just going to take a little bit of break here, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit about that with you, Viv. So don't hang up yet. We'll come back in a moment.
All right.